Welcome to Future Trends, where we examine the latest stories reshaping tomorrow's international dynamics. This week's headlines: Bangladesh's ousted PM sentenced to death, youth-led protests in Mexico, UN approves international stabilisation force in Gaza, US regains lead as top investor in Africa's critical minerals, and first remote robotic stroke procedure. Starting with politics, Pakistan expands army chief's powers. Pakistan's parliament approved a constitutional amendment granting Army Chief Asim Munir new authority and lifelong legal immunity. Critics warn the changes entrench the military's influence over Pakistani politics and erode judicial independence. Ukraine's justice minister suspended amid $100 million corruption probe. The scandal has intensified scrutiny of President Zelensky's anti-corruption efforts as Ukraine faces renewed Russian attacks on its energy infrastructure. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau has charged 7 people, including a former deputy prime minister, with involvement in the alleged kickback and money laundering scheme involving the energy sector. Ecuador rejects return of US military bases. The referendum results opposed lifting the country's long-standing ban on hosting foreign military facilities and effectively blocks the US military from returning to an airbase that was once a hub for Washington's anti-drug operations. It's a setback to President Trump-aligned President Noboa. Benin to extend presidential term. Presidential and legislative terms will increase from 5 years to 7. It's too late for President Talon, as the change comes into effect next year. Bangladesh's ousted PM sentenced to death. Sheikh Hasina was found guilty of crimes against humanity for ordering a crackdown that killed hundreds of people in last year's student-led uprising against her government. Hasina, who fled to India last year, has said the ruling comes from a rigged tribunal established and presided over by an unelected government with no democratic mandate. Moving to stories in conflict, UN approves international stabilisation force in Gaza. The US plan also outlines a potential route towards an independent Palestinian state. Russia, which had circulated a rival resolution, abstained along with China in the 13-0 vote, opting not to use its veto on the UN's most powerful body. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu condemned a handful of extremists after violent settler attacks in a West Bank village following the demolition of an illegal settler outpost. The UN said October had been the worst month for West Bank settler violence since it began recording incidents in 2006, with 264 attacks that caused casualties or property damage. Canada reports increased Russian and Chinese intelligence activity in Arctic. Canada's intelligence service reports increased Russian and Chinese interest in Arctic infrastructure, resources, and technology, alongside attempts to illicitly obtain Canadian goods. CSIS also disclosed disrupting Chinese recruitment efforts and Iranian threats against dissidents. Members of Syria's security forces and military detained over sectarian violence in Sweden. It followed conflict in July where armed groups affiliated with Druze spiritual leader Sheikh Hikmet al-Hijri clashed with local Bedouin clans, spurring intervention by government forces who effectively sided with the Bedouins. Hundreds of civilians, mostly Druze, were killed, many by government fighters. US deploys largest warship to Caribbean. The USS Gerald R. Ford has arrived in the Caribbean as part of a US naval strike force, ordered by President Trump amid escalating tensions over drug trafficking. As a result, Venezuela accused the US of fabricating a crisis, attempting to overthrow the country's left-wing socialist government. Russian spare oil refining capacity offsets drone damage. Russia's oil refining output has fallen only 3% this year despite Ukraine's largest wave of drone attacks. At the height of the strikes between August and October, about a fifth of Russia's refining capacity was offline, but production dropped just 6% to around 5.1 million barrels per day. Turning to the latest news in economics. US regains lead as top investor in Africa's critical minerals. The US directly invested $7.8 billion in 2023 compared to China's $4 billion. The first time since 2012 that America regained the lead as it increasingly focuses on securing access to minerals like lithium, cobalt, and rare earths, needed for electronics, electric vehicles, and AI technology. UK economic growth of 0.1% disappoints in Q3. UK economic growth slowed sharply in the third quarter as a cyber attack on Jaguar Land Rover disrupted production and dragged GDP lower. The attack caused a 29% collapse in motor vehicle output in September, the steepest drop since early 2020. Overall GDP fell 0.1% that month point. Japan's economy contracts as exports down on tariffs. The economy declined at an annualized rate of 1.8% in the July-September period, as US tariffs sent the nation's exports falling. On a quarter-by-quarter basis, Japan's gross domestic product, GDP, slipped 0.4%, the first contraction in 6 quarters, but smaller than the 0.6% drop the market expected. Exports were down 1.2% from the previous quarter. Oversupply of oil could create glut. The International Energy Agency, IEA, warned that global oil markets could face an excess of up to 4 million barrels per day by 2026, as supply continues to outpace slowing demand growth. Despite major producers pausing export increases, the IEA said global production is still rising faster than consumption. Other IEA projections suggest demand will peak by 2030, driven by surging electric vehicle use and renewable energy expansion. Canada and China seek to rebuild economic ties. Canada and China are cautiously improving relations after years of diplomatic strain, driven by trade disputes and tariffs from the US. Beijing has said it will drop the tariffs on Canadian canola if Ottawa does the same for Chinese electric vehicles. Now for news in development. Western aid cuts could cause 22.6 million deaths by 2030. Simultaneous cuts to international aid by the US, Britain, France, and Germany could cause more than 22 million preventable deaths by 2030, including 5.4 million children under 5. It's the first time in the last 30 years that all 4 nations are cutting development assistance at the same time point. Crime and the climate crisis are reshaping Haiti. Since January 2022, more than 16,000 Haitians have been killed in gang-related violence. More than 1.4 million people, nearly half of them children, have fled their homes in 2025, driven by rising gang violence and climate collapse. Throughout the country, droughts and failed harvests in rural areas are pushing farmers into overcrowded cities where overstretched infrastructure fails to stem disease and desperation. UK to end golden ticket for asylum seekers. The reduction in the protections for asylum seekers and refugees was aimed at cutting irregular immigration and countering the far right. Currently, people get refugee status for 5 years, after which they can apply for indefinite leave to remain and eventually citizenship. The UK government said would cut the length of refugee status to 30 months, and refugees will be forced to return to their home countries once they are deemed safe. Explosion on Polish railway was sabotage, says PM. Prime Minister Tusk said an explosive device placed on the tracks was the cause of disruption on a busy railway route between Warsaw and Lublin in eastern Poland. More damage was found elsewhere on the same line, prompting concerns about deliberate targeting of the route, which is used to facilitate aid deliveries to Ukraine. Youth-led protests in Mexico target corruption, drug violence. The rallies, which took place in dozens of cities from Tijuana in the north to Oaxaca in the south, drew large crowds, with some demonstrators carrying the one-piece pirate flag that has become a global symbol of the youth movement. Some protesters held banners and wore hats saluting Carlos Alberto Manzo Rodriguez, the mayor of Uruapan in Michoacán state, who was assassinated, having led a crusade against drug trafficking gangs. President Sheinbaum accused right-wing parties of trying to infiltrate the Gen Z movement. Finally, our social news: drones and AI protect Brazilian rainforest. A Brazilian ecological restoration company won a prestigious Earthshot Prize for using AI and satellite technology to restore degraded forests in the Amazon and Atlantic forest regions. The company uses algorithms to identify optimal restoration areas, acquires land from farmers and ranchers, and employs drones to plant native species, having already planted over 6 million seedlings across 30,000 hectares. India orders hybrid classes for students amid hazardous pollution. Delhi authorities have also banned non-essential construction and restricted goods vehicles as air quality hits severe levels. PM 2.5 levels reached 438, nearly 30 times the WHO safe limit. Big Tech starts complying with Australia's teen social media ban. Online platforms will ping Australian teenagers through over 1 million accounts in coming days, offering a choice. Download data, freeze profiles, or lose the lot when a world-first ban on kinds using social media starts on December 10th. TikTok, Snapchat, and Meta's Facebook, Instagram, and Threads are poised to deactivate accounts registered by users under 16, evidence of ancient tree-climbing drop crocs. Scientists have unearthed Australia's oldest known crocodile eggshells, which may have belonged to drop crocs, creatures that climb trees to hunt prey below. The discovery of the 55-million-year-old eggshells was made in a sheep farmer's backyard. First remote robotic stroke procedure successfully tested. Doctors in Scotland and the US completed the first remote robotic thrombectomy on human cadavers, removing simulated blood clots from the brain. The procedure could improve stroke care access, particularly for patients in rural areas, by allowing specialists to operate from distant locations. That's your Future Trends update for this week. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time with more stories reshaping our world.